The Senate Banking Committee hearing room fell dead silent as Tim Scott leaned into his microphone, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Representative Crockett, you talk about helping communities, but what have you actually done? Besides make noise on social media, the attack was swift, calculated, and designed to embarrass the Texas Democrat in front of millions watching see. But what happened next would shock everyone in that room." Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't look down. Instead, she smiled, the kind of smile that makes opponents nervous. Because what Tim Scott didn't know was that Crockett had been waiting for this exact moment. She had receipts, she had facts, and she was about to deliver a response that would leave the South Carolina senator completely speechless and trending on every social media platform within minutes. This wasn't just another political disagreement. This was about to become an epic takedown that would define both of their careers and show America exactly what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these amazing political moments. Seriously, you won't want to miss what happens next, because this is about to get absolutely wild. Now, let's see how Jasmine Crockett turned the tables on Tim Scott in the most spectacular way possible. The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked about exchanges in recent political history. Senator Tim Scott, sitting confidently behind his nameplate, thought he had found an easy target in the first term, representative from Texas. But he was about to learn that underestimating Jasmine Crockett was the biggest mistake of his political career. The irony was thick in the air. Here was Scott, a man who had spent years positioning himself as the reasonable voice of conservative black politics, about to get schooled by a woman who had actually spent her life fighting in the trenches for justice. The contrasts couldn't have been more perfect. The establishment politician versus the street-smart attorney. The careful moderate versus the unapologetic progressive. The senator who played it safe versus the representative who came to fight. The hearing had been routine until that moment. Discussions about banking regulations, committee business, the usual Washington but tension had been building between Scott and Crockett for weeks over their different approaches to economic policy affecting black communities. Scott, as the highest-ranking black Republican in the Senate, often clashed with progressive Democrats, like Crockett, over solutions to systemic issues. The backstory made this confrontation even more explosive. Just 2 weeks earlier, Crockett had called out Scott's voting record during a CNN interview, noting that he had voted against every major piece of legislation that would have directly helped black families. Scott's team had been furious, issuing press releases and demanding retractions. But Crockett had doubled down, providing receipts for every claim she made. The tension had been simmering ever since, with both sides waiting for the right moment to settle the score. What made this confrontation so explosive was that it came completely out of nowhere. Crockett had been quietly taking notes, listening to testimony, when Scott decided to make her his target. The cameras were rolling, C-SPAN was broadcasting live, and social media was about to explode. To understand why this moment was so significant, you need to know exactly who these two political figures are and what they represent in American politics today. Tim Scott had been riding high in Republican circles. As the only black Republican senator, he carried enormous weight in the party. Born in North Charleston, South Carolina, Scott had built his career on a message of conservative values and personal responsibility. He'd served in the House before moving to the Senate in 2013, and had even made a brief run for president in 2024 before dropping out. Scott's political brand was built on being the reasonable conservative voice, someone who could speak to issues affecting black Americans while maintaining strict Republican principles. He was polished, experienced, and used to being the only black face in Republican leadership meetings. His supporters saw him as proof that the Republican Party was inclusive and forward-thinking. But critics argued that Scott often served as political cover for policies that hurt the very communities he claimed to represent. They said he was more interested in appealing to white conservative voters than actually fighting for black Americans. This tension had been building for months. as Scott positioned himself as a countervass to progressive Democrats. The truth was, Scott had become comfortable in his role as the GOP's go-to black voice. He'd grown used to deference from colleagues, respect from conservative media, and the assumption that his perspective would go unchallenged. He'd participated in countless debates where his identity gave him automatic credibility on racial issues, regardless of his actual positions. This comfort had made him overconfident, perhaps even arrogant about his ability to handle any challenger who might question his approach. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, and she represented everything that made establishment politicians nervous. A former criminal defense attorney from Dallas, Crockett had been elected to Congress in 2022 as part of a new wave of young progressive Democrats who weren't interested in playing by the old rules. At just 42 years old, Crockett had already made a name for herself as someone who didn't back down from fights. She'd gone viral multiple times for her sharp questioning during committee hearings and her ability to break down complex issues in ways that regular people could understand. Her background as a defense attorney had taught her how to think quickly under pressure and how to dismantle weak arguments piece by piece. Crockett represented a district that was majority black and Hispanic, and she'd won her seat by promising to be an unapologetic advocate for working families. She wasn't interested in compromise for the sake of compromise, and she especially wasn't interested in being lectured by Republicans about what was best for her community. What made her particularly dangerous to opponents was her combination of legal training, social media savvy, and genuine connection to the people she represented. Unlike many politicians who seemed disconnected from real struggles, Crockett had grown up in South Dallas and understood poverty, discrimination, and the challenges facing working families firsthand. Crockett had a reputation for doing her homework. Her staff was known for preparing extensive briefing books for every hearing, every meeting, every appearance. She understood that as a black woman in Congress, she would be held to a higher standard than her colleagues. So, she made sure she was always the most prepared person in the room. This wasn't just professional pride. It was a survival strategy in an institution that was still dominated by white men who were often looking for reasons to dismiss her. This confrontation represented much more than two politicians disagreeing. It was about competing visions for how black Americans should engage with the political system. Scott represented the conservative approach: work within existing systems, focus on personal responsibility, don't rock the boat too much. Crockett represented the progressive approach: challenge the system directly, demand structural changes, and never apologize for fighting hard. The hearing room was packed with staffers, lobbyists, and reporters who sensed that something big was about to happen. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation, as clips from earlier in the hearing showed tension building between the two. For Scott, this was supposed to be an easy win. Attack the freshman Democrat, show his conservative credentials, maybe get some clips that would play well with his base. He had the advantage of experience, seniority, and the respect that comes with being a senator. For Crockett, this was about proving that the new generation of Democrats wouldn't be intimidated by Republican attacks. She'd been dealing with condescending attitudes from male colleagues since arriving in Congress, and she was tired of being underestimated. The national political implications were huge too, with Republicans trying to make inroads with black voters and Democrats working to energize their base. This exchange would be watched closely by political strategists on both sides. How these two leaders handled this moment could influence messaging and strategy for years to come. Adding another layer of complexity was the fact that both politicians were being watched by their respective parties for very different reasons. Republican leadership had been growing frustrated with Scott's inability to effectively counter progressive arguments about race and policy. His presidential campaign had fizzled partly because he couldn't articulate a compelling conservative vision for Black America that resonated beyond traditional GOP voters. This hearing was seen as a chance for him to reassert his relevance. For Democrats, Crockett represented the future of the party: young, diverse, media-savvy, and unafraid to fight. Party leadership was curious to see how she would handle her first major confrontation with a senior Republican, especially one who shared her racial identity but held completely opposite political views. But neither Scott nor the packed hearing room was prepared for what Jasmine Crockett was about to unleash. The attack came during what should have been a routine discussion about community development financial institutions. Scott had been questioning witnesses about the effectiveness of Vario. "Do you even know?" The question lingered like a dare. Scott parted his lips to answer, but Crockett pressed on. "And since you rattled off poverty, crime, education, let me spell out what I've actually done, instead of just delivering canned lectures about personal responsibility." What followed was a surgical demolition. Crockett began cataloging concrete achievements, each item landing with the precision of a well-placed strike, exposing Scott's broadside as bluster from someone who drifted away from the grind of real representation. "I brought in $3.2 million in federal support for after-school programming in Dallas. I partnered with local law enforcement and neighborhood groups to launch community policing pilots that cut violent crime 15% across 3 focus areas. I backed and helped advance measures, expanding Pell Grant resources direct relief for students at HBCUs." With every metric, Scott seemed to shrink. He had challenged her substance. She was calmly proving she possessed more actionable results than he'd anticipated. "But here's what truly grates about your little monologue, Senator." A sharper edge entered her tone, and everyone straightened instinctively. "You scold me about going viral, overlooking that digital platforms are how huge numbers of my constituents actually learn what government can do for them. When I post a short video explaining FAFSA, 100,000 young people who might have missed that information now have it. When I tweet a town hall announcement, turnout triples compared to old school notices. When a clip of my questioning circulates, it's because I'm extracting answers that Mataran, the people most affected, are seeing it." She paused, letting the logic settle. "That visibility is service." Silence deepened. The room recognized. It was witnessing a textbook dismantling an exchange destined for endless replay. "And you know what really gets me?" Her voice dropped to a near whisper, amplifying its weight. "You have the audacity to doubt my dedication while you've spent 5 years hauling water for a party advancing policies that harm people who look like us." Scott tried to interject. "Representative Crockett, I'm not finished." The steel in her interruption sliced the air. "You want accomplishments? Let's review yours. Years in Congress, and what's the legacy? You voted against Medicaid expansion that would have delivered health coverage to thousands of black families in South Carolina. You opposed raising the minimum wage. You rejected student debt relief. Every no you cast lands squarely on the backs of the people you claim to champion." Each item fell like a hammer blow, stripping away his self-styled credibility as a defender of black interests, while opposing measures that directly aid those communities. You stood on a presidential debate stage, preaching unity. Yet your record shows repeated choices for party orthodoxy over people's lives. Color flushed Scott's face. Irritation and unease mingled while he searched for footing. She retained absolute command. "And then you presume to question my qualifications." Her volume rose just a fraction more resolve than anger, cadence of someone long accustomed to condescension and determined to bury it. "Senator, I spent years in court as a criminal defense lawyer. I've fought for clients the system was ready to discard. I stood between ordinary citizens and prosecutorial overreach while you were confirming judges inclined to narrow their rights. So when you ask what I've done, here it is. I have never forgotten my roots. I haven't traded my community's interests for political favor. I've never been so hungry for approval from people who don't respect me that I'd sacrifice those I represent." The final turn of the blade drew audible gasps. She had just accused Tim Scott, on camera, of bartering away his own community's needs for advancement. He finally managed, voice taut, "Representative Crockett, that is completely inappropriate." "What's inappropriate?" she shot back. Is a black man in your position weaponizing Republican talking points to tear down a black woman doing the actual work? What's inappropriate is questioning my resume without ever bothering to learn it. What's inappropriate is the entire performance you just staged. She leaned back, having delivered a comprehensive, inenarrably rebel towel. A long beat of stunned stillness followed. Recognizing the proceedings had veered far beyond standard decorum, the chair abruptly called a recess. Too late, the footage was already saturating every platform. The immediate fallout was unlike anything Washington had processed in years. Within minutes, social feeds detonated. A hashtag pairing their names and proclaiming Crockett's triumph vaulted to the trending list inside a quarter hour. The Raw Committee clip rocketed through timelines. Activists, analysts, and casual observers supplied instant commentary. Progressive corners of the internet ignited. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted that this is what happens when someone who does the work is underestimated. Her post amassing hundreds of thousands of likes in mere hours. Lifestyle and culture pages amplified the moment with celebratory captions, introducing Crockett's exchange to audiences that rarely watch committee hearings. Reaction videos flooded TikTok. Young black women especially dissected the tactics and tone, praising how she reframed viral as outreach efficiency. Conservative spaces were markedly restrained. Where responses appeared, they knit demeanor over substance, silence that underscored how decisively she'd won the narrative. Traditional media accelerated the cycle. Cable networks looped the clash. One outlet labeled it a scorching rejoinder. Another framed it as a blueprint for confronting dismissive attacks. Even networks ideologically opposed to her stance covered it, albeit through the lens of decorum. Major newspapers published rapid analyses, one exploring implications for black political leadership, another profiling Crockett as a rising, unflinching progressive communicator. Podcasts devoted special episodes. Sympathetic hosts called it one of the most effective real-time defenses they had witnessed. On the right, many shows simply looked the other way. Scott's team scrambled into triage, issuing a statement lamenting the personal turn. While professing respect for her passion, the effort failed to stem momentum. His attempt on a primetime segment to recast the encounter as an example of Democratic hostility landed poorly. Critics noted he seemed unready when pressed about his own votes. Some conservative commentators who initially cheered the attack quietly backed off, acknowledging privately that he had miscalculated. Operatives speculated that his already waning national aspirations took another blow, appearing outmaneuvered by a first-term representative weakened the aura of seasoned authority he cultivated. For Crockett, the moment became a launchpad. Her office reported an avalanche of supportive messages within a day, notes from colleagues, grassroots organizers, everyday constituents. High-profile party figures amplified her performance as emblematic of a prepared values-anchored generation. Fundraising efforts featuring the confrontation surged, pulling in substantial contributions across multiple candidate committees in a brief window. Strategists swiftly integrated her into messaging plans. Inbound speaking invitations ballooned, forcing rapid expansion of her scheduling and communications capacity. Analysts highlighted wider currents the exchange illuminated. It showed the sharpened media fluency of emergent progressive lawmakers. Fluency in translating hearing room procedural skirmishes into public education moments at scale. It spotlighted the diminishing protective value of identity tokenization. Scott could not deflect critique simply by invoking shared heritage when the challenger matched that identity while brandishing data, casework, and legislative outputs. It underscored social platforms not as vanity metrics but as distribution infrastructure for constituent services and accountability theater. Scholars framed the clash as a live specimen of old hierarchical norms confronting responsive, digitally native advocacy. Reverberations continued. Scott's internal clout appeared to contract. Marquee speaking slots evaporated. Whispers circulated about leadership skepticism over his tactical instincts. And home state polling glimpsed its first meaningful softening in years. Crockett accrued elevated assignments and a steady presence on high-visibility panels and interview circuits. Seized upon as a disciplined messenger under pressure, strategists across the aisle quietly revised playbooks, unresearched, personality-driven, takedowns of highly prepared freshman members, especially women of color, with litigation backgrounds now carried amplified reputational risk. Culturally, the episode evolved into a parable on asserting competence against condescension. It migrated beyond politics into professional development seminars, social justice forums, even workplace training modules on assertive communication. The clipped phrase, "I'm not finished," morphed into a meme and rallying shorthand for respectfully reclaiming space. Law professors referenced the confrontation to illustrate courtroom-honed techniques transplanted to legislative oversight. Months out, consensus among observers cast the moment as an inflection point in rhetorical expectations on Capitol Hill. Crockett demonstrated that rigor, authenticity, and strategic media literacy can neutralize tenure and title. Scott's gambit, intended to diminish, instead elevated her stature while constricting his own. The episode signaled a shifting environment. Deference is no longer automatically conferred by years served. Audiences reward clarity, factual command, and unapologetic advocacy. As one strategist summarized, "Crockett didn't me."